This is Mildred Cho at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. This session is about conflict of interest in biomedical research, including what it is, why they are important, and how they are regulated and mitigated. Perhaps the most important point to understand about conflicts of interest is that they are insidious and probably act at the unconscious level. Another important point is that even very small things can have a disproportionately large effect on human behavior. And although we would all like to think that we are not influenced by financial or other interests, there is a huge pile of evidence to the contrary. I know what you're thinking. These slides have to do with doctors and drug prescribing, so what does that have to do with research? The life sciences and the relationship between academic researchers, their institutions, and the private sector are now extremely complex, as illustrated in this diagram, which shows the relationships in one particular clinical trial. On top of that, academic research is even more competitive than ever. Together, these forces create very strong interests for scientists that are not always conducive to the conduct of the best science. What is a conflict of interest in biomedical research? It exists when a primary interest may be influenced by a secondary interest. These secondary interests may be financial or non-financial, and we'll come back to this definition in much more detail later. Conflicts of interest are ubiquitous in biomedical research, yet we are often unaware of their existence. Nevertheless, they do have effects on how research is conducted, interpreted, and reported. Just considering financial conflicts of interest for the moment, many surveys of academic biomedical researchers and of the literature have found that they are very prevalent. But perhaps even more problematically, researchers have found that much of the time, conflicts of interest are not disclosed in published reports and articles, so readers are not aware that they exist. One type of conflict of interest is industry funding of research. Over the last 4 decades, the proportion of biomedical research funding in the U.S. that is provided by industry has gone from approximately 20% to over 60% and is now twice the level of federal government support. However, academic industry ties were explicitly promoted by legislation passed in the early 1980s in the U.S. The Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 encouraged universities to collaborate with commercial concerns and expected universities to file patents on inventions for the ultimate goal of translating basic research findings into public benefit. As a result, many different types of academic-industry relationships are now common, including licensing arrangements, startup companies, and consulting arrangements. So what does this have to do with conflicts of interest? Let's go back to our definition in more detail. A conflict of interest can only exist where there are primary interests that are also professional obligations or public duties, such as those of elected representatives to their constituents. In the case of academic researchers, these interests can include patient welfare, in the case of a medical researcher, or research integrity, or education, in the case of a teacher. There can only be one primary duty that is dominant over all other interests. A person with primary interests almost always has many other interests which are by definition secondary. These could include financial interests such as stock options in a startup company, or non-financial interests, such as the wish to advance one's career or maintain good relationships with your colleague. Sometimes the integrity of research could take a secondary role in the case of some human subjects research, where patient safety and welfare may be the primary interest. A conflict between primary and secondary interests arises if, in the course of making judgments and carrying out the primary interest, one or more secondary interests influences a judgment and causes an adverse outcome. However, the difficulty in minimizing adverse effects of conflict of interest is that it is almost impossible to tell whether there have been any influences on judgment and whether those influences have directly led to an adverse outcome. For example, in the drug prescribing example mentioned earlier, just because a doctor prescribes a drug to more patients after receiving a hamburger from a pharmaceutical company representative does not necessarily mean that patients were harmed, unless it was clear that the drug was contraindicated for particular patients or that it created unnecessary costs for the patient. Furthermore, it would be very hard to prove that the drug was prescribed as a direct result of the hamburger. Nevertheless, we do have ample evidence that, on average, secondary interests are indeed associated with adverse outcomes and therefore are worth trying to minimize. In the context of biomedical research, adverse outcomes can include a range of effects on many aspects of research where important judgments are made, including choosing a research question or design through deciding whether and how to disseminate findings. For example, a department receiving industry support of research to develop plants that are genetically modified to be resistant to herbicides could discourage its faculty from studying weed control strategies that do not involve herbicides. There's ample evidence that conflicts of interest are strongly associated with positive results, and even more strongly negatively associated with negative results, leading to a strong overall bias in the literature towards positive findings. While some of this is possibly due to general publication bias, it is clear from many studies that this bias is much more pronounced where financial conflicts of interest exist. Perhaps even more concerning is the effect on the process of research. Data show that life science researchers report that they are more likely to withhold data and materials from other researchers if they had industry funding, or even more if they were engaged in patenting, licensing, marketing, or were involved in a startup or a genetic researcher. Researchers were almost always more likely to delay publications by more than 6 months to allow patent application, and even more likely if they were a genetic researcher. Are conflicts of interest in biomedical research regulated? The short answer is yes. There are regulations at the federal level that require institutions to apply for funding from the Public Health Service and investigators who participate in PHS-funded research to disclose and mitigate conflicts of interest. To comply with these regulations, Stanford requires disclosure of financial interests that are related to research, focusing on those interests that are considered significant, but also including those of immediate family members. In peer review and publication, there is also often requirement for reviewers to disclose personal and institutional relationships and to mitigate conflicts of interest by recusal. In publication, disclosed conflicts of interest are often made public. So, does that solve conflicts of interest? Let's go back to our conflict of interest diagram. The goal of mitigation strategies is to prevent undue influence on judgment, so as to prevent adverse outcomes. By disclosing conflict of interest, the idea is that by drawing attention to them, unconscious undue influences will be prevented. However, you saw that even when interests are disclosed, outcomes still appear to be influenced. So disclosure is not a highly effective mitigation strategy. A more effective approach might be to recuse oneself from secondary interests, which would eliminate the possibility of undue influence of those interests. This method is often used, especially in human subjects research, especially where potential for harm to patients is high. However, we cannot recuse ourselves from all secondary interests, such as personal relationships, making this a partial solution. We could also recuse ourselves from primary interests, therefore not participating in key judgments. While this is sometimes used as a strategy, it obviously has its limitations because it interferes with the ability to fulfill obligations to the public. However, researchers can recuse themselves from specific roles, such as aspects of data analysis that are particularly subject to bias, or to decisions about patient enrollment or treatment. Strategies that target judgments directly rather than the secondary or primary interests are advantageous in that they could be equally effective on financial and non-financial conflicts of interest. These include monitoring of key judgments by third parties that are independent of the secondary interest. This is basically peer review, but at early and intermediate phases of the research process. A similar strategy would be to have independent researchers attempt to regulate or replicate your findings. Similarly, research designs can be chosen that eliminate or reduce the impact of external influences. These include using random and or blinded allocation in experimental designs and or blinded analysis. If these strategies just sound like doing good science, that's because they are. Mitigating conflicts of interest not only avoids adverse outcomes, it improves the quality of science.